I'm just going to drop this so she's not staring at it.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Let's stick this in.
Okay. All right, I think we're ready to get started. I know 5:30 is a tough time for people to manage the traffic, take a bus, walk over here. So when we say 5:30, it's usually 5:40. So thank you for your patience. All right, looks like everyone's situated. I'm Alice Madden. I'm the Executive Director of the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment, what we refer to around here as the GWC. And our mission is serving the people of the American West, the nation, and the world through creative, interdisciplinary research, bold, inclusive teaching, and innovative problem solving in order to further true sustainability for our lands, water, and environment. So easy, right? Easy peasy. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you here on behalf of Colorado Law and the GWC. Our Dean, Jim Anaya, deeply regrets he could not be here tonight, just basically because of a scheduling kind of snafu. Hopefully he'll join us later in the evening. But he asked me to read a note in his stead. So this is from Jim Anaya. I apologize I could not be with you this evening, but I would like to welcome you all to Colorado Law and the 10th annual John H. and Cynthia H. Shultz Lecture in Energy. The Schultz Lecture is one of the highlights of the year at Colorado Law and one of the most important endowed lectures. We're extremely grateful for the generosity of John Schultz and the Schultz and Howard families who are here tonight for making this lecture possible. I'd also like to thank the faculty, staff, and advisory council of the Getches-Wilkinson Center for their commitment to making the GWC one of the university's premier policy institution. The Schultz Lectureship Series on oil and gas, energy, and natural resources was designed to provide valuable information to policymakers, practitioners, business executives, and the academic community on emerging issues in these important fields. This year, we're excited to host former FERC Commissioner Colette Honorable, who's had a distinguished career in public service and remains a major proponent in dialogue and bipartisan solutions to pressing energy problems. Please enjoy tonight's lecture and the reception to follow, and we thank you for being part of the Colorado Law community. So as our dean noted, there are many people to thank at an event like this, but above all, we really want to thank the Schultz and Howard family. And they are here tonight. So could you help me give them a warm thank you? You can read more about the series and past lectures, and you will see what this has allowed us to do. We've brought the best and the brightest minds from around the country to really address important emerging issues in all of these fields. Many of our advisory council members are here tonight as well. We had an advisory council meeting. They really help guide the GWC and provide valuable advice along the way. They all got these nifty little badges today. So if you see any of them at the reception tonight, please thank them for their commitment to the school. It really means a lot. And last and certainly not least, I want to thank Sean LaBar, who's back here. I see his arm. So you know, behind something like this, there's someone behind the scenes who really does all the work. And for the GWC, that's Sean LaBar. And he's had a lot going on these last couple of weeks with tonight's event, and we're having a conference tomorrow. So I just want to give Sean a round of applause as well. So now I get to hand this over to Professor Sharon Jacobs to introduce our special guest, Colette Honorable. So in addition to finding our amazing guest for tonight, Sharon Jacobs also spearheaded the organization of a first of its kind for Colorado Law event that we're holding tomorrow, the Women in Energy Law and Regulation Conference. Just as a coincidence, all the speakers and moderators are women. So we're really excited about that. We still have room, and men are allowed, of course. We still have room. It's a free conference. It's starting at 8:30. It's going on all day, and we'll be able to carry on the discussion of the topics that Colette Honorable hits on tonight, and then it will also delve very deeply into the challenges facing our electricity systems. So Sharon Jacobs is a force of nature, and the law school is really lucky to have her. She's incredibly popular with her students and is doing excellent research. In fact, just recently she received Pace University's Hobb Environmental Law Distinguished Junior Scholar Award for her scholarly excellence so early in her career. She's actually going to present her paper at Pace University next year on energy pluralism and democratic substitution. I'm not really sure what that is, but I'm looking forward to read the paper. So please help me welcome Sharon Jacobs.
Thank you, Alice. And let me say what a treat it is for us to have Alice Madden bringing her expertise and her vision to the Getches Wilkinson Center. We're lucky to have her. Thank you, Alice. So I'm Sharon Jacobs. I am a professor here at the law school. I teach energy, environmental, and administrative law. It's a privilege for me to be part of a program that's as vibrant as Colorado laws when it comes to natural resources and energy and the environment. And that's a program that's made possible in large part by the vision and generosity of people like John Schultz. So I just want to add my thanks to him and to the Schultz family. Michael is here as well. He is a graduate of our law school, and we're so happy to have you here as well. John Schultz has made substantial gifts beyond endowing this lectureship series. He has donated to our loan repayment assistance program, which allows some of our students to remain in Colorado and bring their talents to jobs here, enriching our own communities, as well as endowing a student scholarship and an energy fellowship that is currently held by our own Professor William Boyd. So we thank you for all of your work and dedication to the law school. We're now in the 10th year, if you can believe it, of the Shultz Lecture series, and we wanted to do something really special this year and could think of no better way to celebrate the 10th anniversary of this lecture series than by inviting Colette Honorable, who happily agreed to join us. Another way, of course, that we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of this series is by pairing it with tomorrow's Women in Energy Conference, which Alice has already talked about. We hope that many of you will join us for that. We'll have panels throughout the day on really nuts and bolts issues in electricity law. It just so happens that all of our moderators and panelists and speakers will be women. And at lunch, Illinois Commerce Commissioner Sharina Mae Edwards will be delivering a keynote. We're glad to have her as well. But back to this year's speaker. So in energy law class this week, I was talking to my students about the restructuring of the electricity industry over the past several decades, which is, I'm sure I can see their eyes, everybody's favorite topic during the course of the semester. Those of you that know it well understand what I mean. But one point that I really emphasize to the class is that restructuring does not mean deregulation. And in fact, that is a mischaracterization. The government plays a key role in market regulation, even though we have increasing competition in various parts of the industry. And the government still, therefore, plays a key role in shaping our energy future. And within the government, individuals also can have a voice in that process. And that's why it's so important that we have more leaders like our speaker here tonight, Colette Honorable. She is a recently retired FERC commissioner and has a distinguished record in public service. She came to FERC after 7 years on the Arkansas Public Service Commission, 4 of those as chairman of the commission. And her tenure at FERC and at the Arkansas Commission came during a time of marked industry change, including disruption caused by the sudden growth of natural gas in the industry, of increasing numbers of renewables penetrating the grid. And so while at FERC, she oversaw conversations about wholesale market design, the role of energy storage in wholesale power markets, the importance of fuel diversity, and integrating ever-increasing quantities of renewable generation into the grid, among other topics. She's currently a partner at Reed Smith in Washington, D.C., and a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a think tank that emphasizes consensus and common ground in addressing key challenges facing the nation. She's also a past president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, and I'm going to embarrass her a little bit now because earlier this year, NARUC issued a resolution honoring her for her dedication to safety, reliability, resilience, and diversity in our energy systems, and championing her own championing of clean energy. And they cited her fierce intellect, while noting that she also has the ability to transform any disagreement into pleasant conversation, which is a skill indeed, and that she raises the civility of the discourse while not conceding her points. Tonight, Commissioner Honorable will talk about the state of U.S. energy policy following the Paris Climate Agreement and the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, and we'll focus on the ground-up leadership that we've seen from grassroots organizations, from local and state officials, and industry in the wake of the federal government's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. And this is a particularly appropriate topic for a lecture here in Colorado, where our state-level efforts to promote cleaner energy generation, transmission, and use have served as models for the nation. After this lecture, we will take Q&A, and we have a tradition here at Colorado Law School that the first question will come from a student. So those of you in the audience who are students, I know I didn't tell you this when I asked you to come tonight, but please be thinking about questions during the lecture. I am not afraid to cold call, as you know. So please join me without further ado in welcoming Colette Honorable.
Good evening. All right. It is still a good evening. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Professor Jacobs, for that very kind introduction. You did your homework at the end. It's an honor to be here with you. I love being on college campuses and particularly being in this courtroom. It's really magnificent, and I understand that your 10th Circuit convenes here from time to time. I've had a few appellate arguments, and it can be a daunting experience. I'm glad you get to enjoy this courtroom in other settings when you're not so nervous. I want to thank the Majority Leader, Madden, and Sean, wherever he is. Thank you. It took a village to get me here. So Professor Jacobs extended this invitation when I was still at FERC. And I sent back a note, or someone did from my team, and said, now, you know she's leaving. And Professor Jacobs said, yes, but we still want you to come. Thank goodness. I'm delighted to be here. I see a number of friends in the room. I want to first acknowledge the Schultz family. To Mr. Schultz and your lovely wife, who I know has gone on to higher places, and to your beautiful family. It was an honor to meet each of you, Cynthia, Dave, and Michael, who's carrying on the family tradition. Thank you for, Mr. Schultz, your leadership and your work in this sector. And if you look around to see this is your legacy, this gives me a chill now. And I'm honored to be part of the 10th anniversary celebration of the Shultz Lecture and ahead of the Women in Energy lecture series. Now, I have to offer my regrets. I have a woman at home. She's a 16-year-old, and she has a cheer competition, and they made it through to the finals. So I've got to get home. First things first, right? I certainly want to acknowledge Dean Anaya for his leadership here, and Dean Weiser. I know him affectionately as Phil, wherever Phil might be. Oh, there, you're hiding. So Phil and I go back a ways, and certainly I want to acknowledge Governor Ritter. I've worked with him quite a bit over the years, going back to my days as a commissioner in Arkansas, and I just have fond memories of engagement with Bill Ritter and how he really challenged us in our respective states to rise up and do better. And I was just with him at the Aspen Institute, so it's always good to be back in Colorado. Now, let me press on to a few of the things I'd like to talk about tonight. I want to compliment Sharon because you really teed up quite nicely a rear view mirror look at the work that we undertook at FERC. And since I'm here at a law school, I should also add really the transformative evolution of energy law and jurisprudence. And it's really quite remarkable if you look back, and before I go any further, I need to know who's in the audience. Law students. Of course, back on the back. We're going to do the Socratic method tonight. Did I tell you that part? Okay, law students holding up the back row like in church. We have lawyers here. Okay, you were slow to fess up. And who else may I ask about? Professors? Okay, good. So if you think back about the evolution of energy law and jurisprudence as it pertains to FERC. It's really quite remarkable to think about the fact that in just a few very short years, the U.S. Supreme Court has taken up a number of cases that relate directly to FERC's jurisdiction and how it should interplay with states. So as you know, that's an increasingly tense area, and Sharon spoke about this increasing tension with the development of state energy policy, and yes, FERC's jurisdiction over the operation of wholesale energy and capacity markets. So it's been a phenomenal time. Thinking back to the One Oak versus Lear Jet case, coming forward to the EPSA docket, certainly these cases have really, for some, made the line more clear, and others blurred it a bit with regard to state and federal jurisdiction. It's been a fascinating time for us. And then to go and sit in the U.S. Supreme Court chambers, particularly when the EPSA case was heard, it was really humbling to hear some of the justices being a little critical of our work, and others who seem to attempt to understand how deep these tensions run in figuring out who's on first. And even in the last months of my tenure at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we continue to grapple with this challenge as we try to make sure that markets are operating as intended while ensuring that they are providing lowest cost resources for consumers. That's what markets are meant to do, while ensuring reliability through fuel diversity. And so I think, Sharon, you really teed those issues up quite nicely. It's really been an incredible journey in 10 years as a federal and state regulator. But more importantly, why are we here tonight? I hope that we can focus collectively on what has been occurring in the last few years, not only domestically but globally, as we have grappled or not together with the issue of climate change, deeper decarbonization, and what that means for each state, each community, each town, each nation, each country, each continent. And in this journey for me, it's been an incredible opportunity to work alongside, yes, local folks at home, municipalities and city councils that were really trying to get a handle on how they could lead and serve. How that was occurring at the state level through, in Arkansas, investor-owned utilities. What was happening regionally with regard to regional transmission planning and cost allocation, and yes, operation of wholesale markets. What was happening or not nationally with regard to the development or not of national energy policy. And moving now through an 8-year term of a president that really put this country on the map. And I say that even though I was appointed by him, but notwithstanding that point. We'll take a look back at that administration's leadership, of which Phil was a part, and looking at where we are today and why you matter in that mix. So if you'll go back with me, President Obama launched his Climate Action Plan in June of 2013. You all probably watched the State of the Union as I did and heard him proudly speak about the need to move forward with an actionable plan. Now, there had been a number of presidents before him that at least recognized that energy issues were a challenge that needed to be addressed globally because of the national and international impacts on the U.S. and our neighbors around the world. And so this administration went about setting forth a number of initiatives that focus very diligently on ways in a number of different sectors to address the issue of climate change. Certainly, the Clean Power Plan was announced by President Obama in March of 2015. EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy set about the arduous task of bringing together states and industry and federal government around this issue of how can we focus collectively and reduce, in particular, CO2 emissions. That was a challenge because we were faced with the potential for what had been traditionally economic regulators, really feeling that they had somehow become environmental regulators. But one thing that I said throughout that time is that leadership continued to come from places around the country. I'm very proud of this nation's work in these years, but yes, leadership came from you too. And we're going to talk about that resurgence in just a moment here in the U.S. So as you know, that administration went about a number of ambitious goals to reduce methane emissions. A number of us, and I'm sure Phil and I sat around some roundtables at the Department of Energy, at the White House, focused on not only methane emissions, but pipeline safety. And the fact that these two objectives were not mutually exclusive and that we could focus on, along with gas companies and others, pipeline companies, focus on ways to improve technological advancement, speed up, or either complete the process of removing pipe that wasn't fit for service and therefore less safe and more prone to leaks and explosions, while at the same time reducing methane emissions. As I mentioned, the administration was very focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in particular CO2, hydrofluorocarbons, et cetera. Now then, fast forward to how we continue to engage around the globe. And there were a number of folks who were very, very active in leading this discussion around the globe. I had a very, 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 very small part of that. But I was honored to participate in the second high-level plenary discussions hosted at the International Energy Administration, where countries around the globe came together to defend their greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals. So I sat there representing the U.S., and there were other participants there from the U.S., alongside our colleagues around the world, and we challenged one another. And I went with the goal that the administration had put forward, that Administrator McCarthy had diligently pursued, and I defended our goals and combated questions about why do we still have coal in the mix? What are we going to do about gas? How will we get to that emissions goal by 2030 or 2032? So it was fascinating, and it really brought to my attention the need to focus a great deal on not only clean energy and integration, but also technological innovation and integration. And also ensuring that even with all of the fuels and sources in the mix, focusing on ways to do so that are even more environmentally sustainable. Yes, gas would continue to be part of the mix. Yes, coal too. And I think even under the EPA's goals set out by President Obama, coal would continue to be part of the mix in 2032. But we still need to be focused on carbon capture and sequestration, on energy storage, on distributed generation, et cetera. And so the work at FERC really began to take on so much more of the technical work. And I was very pleased about that, having been trained and grounded in the realities of what we needed to undertake from a technical perspective going forward. Now, certainly, since that time, there's been a change in administration. That's been very clear. And certainly, the new administration has announced, I believe in March, in late March it was, an executive order focused on energy independence. So when I talked about earlier a number of prior presidents that have focused on this issue and grappled with this energy issue, certainly there are a number of lofty goals at issue: energy independence, energy security, abundance, affordability, reliability, resilience. And so now we've finished 8 years of incredible progress, if I might say so, and now pivoting with a new administration that is a little concerned about over-regulation. So that's why I greatly appreciated Professor Jacobs' opening remarks. As you know, that work has continued. On October 9, EPA Administrator Pruitt announced that he would repeal the Clean Power Plan. Certainly, moving ahead, DOE, the Department of Energy, just this month announced a notice of proposed rulemaking, a NOPR as we call it, that would be focused on and directing the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to determine whether we need grid resiliency rules that focus on providing subsidies for coal and nuclear, as they are very challenged in competitive markets, quite frankly. Now, this is interesting because in my last week, Sharon, at FERC, I gave a speech at the EIA, which, as you know, is a part of DOE. And the keynote speaker was Secretary Perry, and he expressed concern about regulation, and he expressed concern about the ability of coal and nuclear to compete, and also raised a concern about whether renewables were impacting the reliability of the grid. So where did little old me fall in the lineup? Right after Secretary Perry. So I attempted to sidestep some of the political part. I didn't pass up a point to mention something that Professor Jacobs did. Proper regulation is good, and I suggest to you that it's necessary. We need someone calling balls and strikes, and FERC sits as a quasi-judicial, independent commission and an arbiter over disputes and contract reviews and rate-making matters and applications for projects like pipelines and hydropower facilities and LNG terminals. Yes, and all of the other things that Sharon and I have discussed tonight. But we also need to make sure that in doing so that we are fair and that we are fuel neutral. So in the same way that I came to FERC thinking we've really got to focus on how to create and foster and nurture a platform for innovation, for improvement, for moving in the way that technology is moving, and in the way that generation is being developed, quite frankly, around the country, where it's being developed. I had to make the point that proper regulation is necessary. We've seen that with the development of non-conventional gas resources in the U.S., and quite frankly, that alone, which is regulated at the state level, I might add, has really singled out the U.S. from every other place in the world and has completely transformed our standing. If you'll recall, 10 years ago at DOE, there were dozens of import applications for LNG terminal. If you look at that map today, it's completely flipped on its head. No matter what you think about gas and whether it should be part of the mix, gas certainly has enabled lower electricity costs. It's a cleaner burning source of fuel, and it has given us over 100 years of security in the abundance that it has provided. And that has also allowed this country to participate in global gas markets for the first time in our nation's history. That's regulation. Because we could have easily been beset by other places around the world that really haven't been able to get past some of these challenges based upon the way that they are structured. And I'd be delighted to talk with you more about that as I engage with my colleagues around the world. I was just in Brisbane this year speaking on markets and LNG evolution, and they're baffled about how our electricity prices have remained so low, given the fact that we are exporting. It's regulation. If you'll recall, Secretary Ernie Moniz directed a study to determine whether the export of LNG would impact domestic gas prices substantially. And after there was a good finding there, the progress continued. So regulation has its proper place. During the Q&A at that EIA speech, someone asked, do you think, I knew that question would come, do you think renewables have impacted grid reliability? And I said, no, I don't think that, in my professional opinion. I've been to regional transmission organizations and independent system operators. I've been in those control rooms. In fact, I was in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where I'm from, at the Southwest Power Pole Control Center. It's a regional transmission organization charged with, it's like the air traffic controller for the grid in that region, which is now spanning most alongside the mid-continent independent system operator, quite a bit in the south and now headed into the west. I was in that control room on the day when they had a record wind output on their grid, almost 50%. And on that day, it was like another day in the office. Not a problem, not a hitch. And so I said, no, I don't see any problems with reliability. And I say, bring on more renewables, which promptly headlines said I took on Perry. And so I announced I was leaving that week. Seriously, my term was up June 30th, and I decided that 10 years of regulation was quite enough. So where are we today? FERC is now grappling with this NOPR. By the way, this particular NOPR by the Secretary was probably only the second time that this authority had ever been exercised by the Department of Energy. And I think the first time was back in the 70s. Now, FERC is some 40 years old this year, in fact, and now grappling with what to do with this concern, not only by the Secretary, but from lots of others, about how we can make sure that all sources and resources compete in markets. Now, FERC has to also walk through a narrow lens, if you will, and it's one that challenged me as a regulator, having mandates from the Federal Power Act, the Natural Gas Act, under NEPA, how to make sure that we walk through all of the mandates of not only Congress, but of the courts. A number of courts of appeal are addressing issues attendant to the work happening at FERC, taking a look at environmental assessments carried out by FERC. In fact, very recently, I believe in August, one of the courts of appeals, I believe the DC Circuit, determined that FERC had not conducted a proper or a sufficient environmental assessment of a particular pipeline project. That happened on my watch, so I have to own up to that. But again, we need that check and balance. FERC is not independent from everyone, and if someone doesn't like the decision at FERC, first I say, advocate. Make your views known on the record. Second, if you don't like the result, take it up. And I've publicly applauded the environmental groups that have really upped their game and are really calling folks to task, not only FERC, DOE, and others, about the ways in which we carry out this work, and that's important. And that is what's beautiful about this civic society in which we live, that we have a process to do it, and we need lots of energy lawyers who are willing to take it on. Now, I admit when I started, I was a litigation lawyer, and I'd worked in the public sector. I have to mention Phil again to thank you. He moved on. To thank him for his service here and for putting himself up in the ways in which he has. It's really admirable. But we have so much work to do. Now, the silver lining to this story that I just told about where we're headed as a nation is that now what we are seeing is a resurgence of leadership, and it's coming from you. It's coming from everyday people all over the country. It's coming from mayors. It's coming from grassroots groups, and it's really quite phenomenal. I want to mention a few, and then I'll wrap up and take a few questions. In June of 2017, former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg announced an incredible initiative focused on greenhouse gas emissions policies and programs. $200 million he provided for that program. He also extended a challenge, and from there, we heard from a number of mayors around the world, the climate mayors. And I know that the Boulder mayor is part of that. I believe there are some 15 mayors by last count. The list was last updated October 17, I believe. Some 15 mayors in Colorado, some 381 mayors who have stepped up to say, we will continue the pledge of the Paris Agreement. That's incredible. And it's leadership coming from local levels. And it's really demonstrating the power of the people. Where I'm living now in the DC area, there is certainly an interagency effort focused on smart cities work. Now, we know you guys know more about smart cities than most, having been the ground zero for smart cities. But now I'm grateful for the ways in which we are focused on smart cities initiatives, not just what the benefits are, but also what the impacts are. What are the costs? What are the impacts to certain communities? What are the impacts to economic development, quite frankly? Who's going to be losing their jobs with automation? We need to be focused on all of those things. So we've really seen, particularly in my 10 years as a regulator, quite a shift in the work of the regulator. And you've got to be nimble and smart and, yes, savvy, and have the ability to work well with people even if you don't agree. And that's been challenging for me at times. But I've learned to speak less and listen more. And that's something we need to do together. And I've learned that in Arkansas, treating everyone with respect, agreeing to disagree without being disagreeable, and also staying focused on what we have in common. And there are a number of initiatives. Still In is one, I think, that's out there, where everyday people are signing up saying, we will be committed to carrying on this important work. It's not just for us, it's for generations coming after us, after all. So I'm really pleased to be here in Boulder tonight and at this law school, and I know how much Boulder has been focused on these issues, and it's really an honor to be standing here in this courtroom at this law school, particularly for the Shultz Lecture, but also ahead of the Women in Energy work ahead tomorrow. It's really inspiring to see leadership coming from you as well. And I'm certainly aware of how distinguished this university has been in over 50 years of climate and energy research, and the way that you continue to lead. I want to encourage you to keep that up. Stay focused. There is so much political rhetoric now, and we need to get away from that. When I was invited by the Bipartisan Policy Center to serve as a senior fellow, I didn't know quite how to take that senior fellow. When I looked at the website, I saw names like George Mitchell and Bob Dole, and I was humbled by that. And then there's little old me. But I will take on this cause as a goal to continue this work, and I don't need a title, and neither do you, to be willing to lean in and not dial out on these important issues, because this work and the groundwork that we're laying today will impact generations to come. So it's been an honor to serve, and honestly, I'm honored to have the opportunity now in this new role to continue working in policy and to continue trying to make a difference. And I encourage all of you to do the same. So with that, I've probably talked quite a bit. I'm going to pause, and I'm looking for that one student, somebody on that back row, who's been waiting with a really good question. Thank you so much for your attention tonight.
Thank you so much. We are looking for a student to open the questioning. If we have a hand out there, as I said, I'm not afraid to call. Oh, excellent. Morgan, thank you. I will walk this mic back to you.
And what year and that kind of thing.
I'm not a law student, actually. I study renewable energy out of the environmental school on the other side of campus.
Oh.
But I'm in
Sharon. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm in Sharon's energy law and regulations, so I'm really interested in it. But I was curious, as a regulator, you mentioned these like very narrow hallways that you had to walk through with the mandates and Federal Power Act and things like that, and how you're able to balance that with your personal opinion when you're not necessarily allowed to say the things you want to say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, Morgan. And the simplest way I can answer it is say you have to remove self, because I didn't go there to issue my thesis about what should happen. I raised my right hand and said I would take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the law, and to carry out this work with integrity and in the public interest. And that last one really encompassed our work. So our role was quite complex. Sometimes some of the work was fairly perfunctory. Let's say someone needed a capacity release or for a certain pipeline objective. Some of those were fairly routine. But some of the work was quite daunting. When you think about the fact that FERC, he heard and said grace, if you will, over some $500 billion in infrastructure and critical assets. That's pretty daunting. And when I speak to kids in elementary school and middle school, I say we didn't hear any cases that were worth hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars. Those dockets were worth millions of dollars and billions of dollars. So the stakes were very high. Then layer on top of that the fact that we got pressure from all sides, from our oversight by Congress. We were hauled up to ask why we were taking so long on some pipeline dockets. And then we had protesters who said we didn't meet any pipelines we didn't like. And even some Democrats who requested an inspector general investigation of whether we were rubber stamping decisions. But I can tell you, with each and every man and woman I worked with, our goals were the same. And most of the time, even though there are 5 commissioners who are appointed in staggered terms by the president, confirmed by the Senate, 3 are of the president's party and 2 are not. Over 90% of the time, our decisions were unanimous because we were focused on what is the law, what is the request, what is in the record, not what's in the newspaper, not what someone said on the news, what's in the record. That's very important. And as lawyers, I know you all and law students, you appreciate that. And what policies and precedent there were before us. And then, once you sift all of that, is that call in the public interest? Now, certainly there were opportunities when we needed to find or make an exception to a policy. We could not do that with the law. And so even if personally I would have been challenged by a particular matter, I had to be decisive and make a call and remove myself from the discussion. So some people would say, how is it you're working on clean energy and you've cited all these pipelines? Because that was my job. And they proved their case, and it was in the public interest. Now, as commissioners, you also have the ability to set priorities. In mine, I had several. I focused quite a bit on markets, transmission planning, and cost allocation. I also focused on resilience, cybersecurity, and making sure our grid and our critical infrastructure would be prepared for any attack, whether it was a severe weather event, a physical attack on the grid, a cyber event, a geomagnetic disturbance, or an electromagnetic pulse. I know, somebody's going to go to sleep now. But those are all things your regulator needs to be worried about. But then we needed help from you guys. I enjoyed my partnerships with academia, quite honestly, because you think about things in different ways and challenge our work, which we need. It's a very healthy thing. But I also focused on diversity and inclusion, and also workforce readiness. There are a number of places in the energy sector which, quite frankly, are behind and need to better prepare for not only the graying of the workforce, but also innovation. And we are just not ready to grapple with the magnificent technological advances that are coming up now and the ways in which consumers are really leading. So in all of the other transformations we talked about, one that I certainly should have mentioned was the role of consumers, and how I used to give a speech about the fact that it's not your grandfather's utility anymore. Consumers want information differently. They want generation differently. They don't want some sources and they want others. They want 24/7 information. They want to get on a website and see if their lights are out and when they're coming back on. And they don't want to talk to us, by the way. And consumers want more input and ability to determine what serves them when it does, to control their energy usage, and yes, their neighbors too. So we're in a completely different time. And the ability now and seeing the convergence of a number of not only prime mover energy sectors, but also entire major GDP economic sectors converging together, telecommunications and energy and water. It's really fascinating to see. I think we're going to look back on this time in 10 years and be amazed at how we did it all. But the best way to do it all is to remove yourself from the equation. It's not about me. So I try to remember that. Yes. I'm sorry.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Commissioner Honorable, for what you did for our company. I'm Lynn Green, the CEO of Lucky Corridor LLC, which is a FERC Transco. And right when you joined the commission, we got what I think is a unanimous order giving us, I think we were the first company to get 100% negotiated rate authority.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is to build transmission between the number one quality renewable energy zone in the world at the Colorado-New Mexico border,
Yes.
and the retiring coal hub, Four Corners, which I think is the biggest retiring coal hub in America. And our job as a FERC Transco, with your 100% negotiated rate authority that you gave us, is to build and to permit and acquire the transmission corridor between point A and point B, so that Four Corners can be a renewable energy hub into the future. So
That's yet another transformation that is really quite remarkable. And that
Yes.
Four Corners area, I've been concerned about it, frankly, and I'm pleased to see how things are progressing there. Thank
It's
you for
very
your
hard.
leadership.
So far we have 67 miles of high voltage transmission right of way in a really key area. We have more to go. I'm an alumna of the law school, 38 years practicing law before I kind of retired and devoted myself to getting FERC authority to transform the Four Corners coal hub. And you had a big role in that, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your role in voting for our negotiated rate authority. But it still is a problem. We are in the unorganized area of WEC. And I don't know how many people in this audience understand what a big deal it is to be in an unorganized portion of the American grid. Various folks, including the FERC, have tried to start RTOs in our area, and yet it isn't happening. So cost allocation is beyond our reach. We're a merchant project, and now
it's
there's
challenging, yeah. for
it's very
merchants.
challenging. And now there's a new thing going on where Xcel has started what's called Mountains West Transmission Group, which many people think wrongly is an RTO, but it isn't. It's not, for instance, my company cannot go to any of the meetings, even though we're a transmission provider and a FERC Transco. We're not allowed. SPP. And nobody, even the regulators in Colorado and New Mexico, really understand whether they're going to start oscillating the electrons at the SPP frequency or at the WEC frequency, and whether, like, I'm only 62 miles away from Four Corners in a number one renewable energy zone. If they successfully, Xcel takes us into SPP, then I believe that our electrons go all the way north in WEC, all the way over to the West Coast, down to Palo Verde, and back over to Four Corners, rather than going directly to Four Corners. So we'd be at the end of a very long train of electrons going into Four Corners, and Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska would be ahead of us, and it would reinforce the historic loop flow problem that has really hampered WEC and made it have high line losses. So I just want to know if, after working with the American Southeast, which you've been a part of your whole career, which is the other unorganized portion of the American grid, and this area, if you can teach us anything about what we should do to solve the problems of the unorganized portion of the American grid.
That's a great question. And again, thank you for your leadership in forging ahead with pursuing 100% negotiated rate authority, because some people look to see if there's precedent, and if there's not, they don't want to be the ones to kind of stick their neck out. So thank you for that. And that's an example. I can't take credit for that. I was one of a few. That's the good thing about having a newer commissioner. You're not wedded to anything. And I could ask, why are we doing this way? And shouldn't we do it a different way? But I think it's a great illustration about the role that regulation could play in removing barriers. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that portion of the country, because I've been very focused on what has been happening in the West. And I had one advisor whose sole job was to keep up with that. I took lots of meetings from folks in the West because I felt a little disconnected from it, because it was unorganized. There was no regional transmission organization there or independent system operator other than the California ISO. And I was so sad to learn about the Northwest Power Pool effort falling apart. I appreciate the technical concerns that you raise, because when I think about that, it takes me back to my days as a state regulator and thinking about how best to serve consumers. And coming from one of the states with the lowest per capita income, consumers could not afford to have high electricity prices. I was proud that we had among the lowest. I sound like a politician now, I know, but I was very proud of that. But also, we couldn't have high electric. People just couldn't afford it. We had a very high low-income population, a very high elderly population, and also that drives away industry. With energy being among their highest overhead. So thinking about those technical aspects and challenges of wheeling charges and loop flows, and that's going to make folks' eyes glaze over. But what that says to me also is inefficiency and higher costs for consumers. That's the concern at the end of the day. So what are the lessons that I've learned in 10 years? One, there is tremendous benefit in the regional construct. I've worked diligently in not one or two, but three. And I've gotten a lot of gray hair, and I know I'm going to heaven because I did. But in those meetings as regulators, we had a different focus than most of the other market participants, focused on what is in the interest of consumers at home. Now, folks from industry don't like to hear me say that because they say, well, we're for the consumer too, and they put up their Venn diagram and the consumer's in the middle and all that. But you have a dual obligation. So we liked that we wore that white hat, and for the most part, not all the time, but that was important. That is I learned that early on. So those meetings were painful, long. I learned more about transmission congestion than I ever wanted to. But that it was divine, because all of that experience prepared me for the role I would take on at FERC. And that's why I was not only interested but concerned about what was happening in the West, because I knew that we could have a better way. We can't keep operating with all of these balancing authorities. And with everyone I met in the West, I heard a different number. You know, someone would come in and say one number, someone would come in and say another. I don't know if they know how many there are. 37, I think. And that's a different number. I've heard 39 and I've heard 35. But we have to acknowledge, number one, no matter where you come from in this regional debate, that there certainly are benefits to participation in regional transmission planning and cost allocation, and market operations. See, that's the other crux of it that I think is lost, and that means consumers are losing. So one thing I recommend is continue coming to the table. Even with the California ISO work and the fact that the legislature didn't pass the legislation to expand who could serve on the governance board. As you might imagine, folks in California are skeptical of everyone else, and everyone's skeptical of California. And they don't want California's goals put on them. So we have to be willing to stop being so rooted in ourselves. It's getting to my point that I made with Megan, is it? Morgan, thank you. And quit coming to the table with our own interests. Now, when I voted as a regulator in the Southwest Power Pool, if I only thought about what was best for Arkansas, I never would have voted for a thing. You've got to step back and think what is best for the region. That is how, and I was actually a state commissioner when we developed the first wind cost allocation methodology, and it terrified me at the time. I thought, I don't know, will I get raked over the coals by the legislature? But look at it today. Look at all of that wind in that footprint. It's phenomenal. And I think that we have to exhibit courage. And I think that's something I should have mentioned in response to Morgan's question as well. We have to make the hard calls. And even the ones that aren't popular, to do what is right and what is best. So I think most of all, and it seems really fuzzy and fluffy, but I just hope that people will continue to come to the table and focus on the collective goals and objectives that they have in mind, and focus on ways to become more efficient, and hopefully we'll get there. I have to believe that all of this work is going to mean something. So I'm saying that to you too. Keep getting in there every day. Suit up every day. Those elbow pads on and knee pads. Because I'm hopeful that with people like you and others who are continuing to step up and lead, we will get there. There's a hand here and one there. So we got to do, can we do 2 more questions? Uh-oh. Okay. Caitlin, hello. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good to have you. So, Commissioner Honorable,
This is going to be good. Bring it.
Now that I have you here without your commissioner hat on, and DOE has done some very interesting things lately. I'm curious if you believe, or if you think that FERC should act to do something to the extent it has power to address some of the market issues right now, particularly that are affecting baseload generation across various parts of the country. And is resiliency pricing, as proposed by DOE, the right way to go about that?
Great question. I knew it was going to be good, Caitlin. So let's take a quick walk down memory lane. At FERC, and long before I got there, FERC undertook an effort to focus on market reforms, because up until that point, FERC was really playing whack-a-mole, addressing one application, but then as soon as you do that one-off, that bolt-on fix, you've messed up 2 or 3 other things happening with markets. And then FERC really began to focus on price formation, looking at mitigation strategies and operator action, focusing on broader policy efforts. You'll recall, and I mentioned in my remarks, the May 1 and 2 Tech Conference, in which FERC, I guess there were 2 of us at that point, 2 women, too, holding up the grid, who, until I left and left Cheryl there by herself, but she was fine. She did fine. We really grappled with these growing tensions in markets, and the fact that we weren't going to get anywhere if we both came to the table and pounded and said, you know, in my state, my governor said we're going to go down this path of integrating hydro, and our legislature has passed certain legislation that the commission must mandate, and the commission has other initiatives and things under its belt and underway. And FERC saying, well, yeah, well, you can do that in your 4 corners, but we have jurisdiction over the whole market. We'll never get anywhere with that discussion. Did I recognize that there were certain results from the operation of wholesale markets that weren't sustainable long term? Absolutely. And I think if somebody researched, they would hear me talk about the fact that we absolutely need nuclear in the mix. And it makes no sense to me that plants with life are going offline. In Arkansas, we had quite a bit of nuclear, 20%, I think, with A&O units 1 and 2. Entergy ran them. Ran 24/7, 365. Low cost, of course, once you get through that huge capital expenditure. Now, do we have to figure out what to do with the waste? Absolutely. But it's carbon-free. It is a baseload capacity. I think we're having a discussion now about what does baseload mean. But yes, I get that. A pure economist theory about the operation of markets would tell you markets are operating the way that they should. You rise and you fall in markets. You live and you die in markets. And that we should let free markets rule. Now, what if we start tinkering with that? What if we decide we like certain fuels, and for whatever reason? So resiliency is but one attribute in markets, honestly. We've talked about them. Fuel diversity, affordability, reliability. And certainly resilience is, in my mind, not always the same as reliability. Reliability is keeping the lights on every day. Resilience is preparing for what may come and how to bounce back from that. So, do I understand the issue? Yes. And I'm not going to interject myself into this discussion. I will say FERC's role is to be fuel neutral. And I think the Secretary, subsequent to issuing this NOPR, which in the title it said it was a direction to FERC to consider this grid resiliency rule effort. He subsequently said, listen, I wasn't trying to give a directive, it's a conversation starter. And I heard Commissioner Cheryl LaFleur say, well, mission accomplished. We're having a conversation. We've been having a conversation. Now, have circumstances changed somewhat? Yes. We know that there are coal generation units that are threatened, nuclear too. But there are other types of generation. Heck, we were just talking about merchant generation. I remember being a state regulator and feeling so sad for some of the merchant operators who were really having a hard time surviving. So how do we pick and choose? And should FERC pick winners and losers? I suggest not. So I don't want to be critical of the NOPR because certainly it was within the Secretary's authority to issue it. But FERC now has to deal with the hard part, quite frankly, and with all due respect to DOE. In all issuing and considering, issuing decisions, considering all of the attributes we talked about that regulators must have. And here, by God, is independence and political courage. Because FERC has to do what it does best, which is not to allow politics to play into this. Now, in fairness, some have said, I just heard a group of regulators at a conference say, well, the last 8 years have been political. Well, maybe or maybe not. But the point is, here what we have is a shift in policy. And the pendulum has swung from, if you're on the left, way up here to way over here. And it's whiplash. And what will be the impact of that in markets? When markets really should provide certainty and transparency, consistency. So I think FERC will be very challenged with that, how to ensure fuel neutrality. First, asking this question of themselves, is there a reliability concern? Number two, if there is, can that decision be found in a fuel neutral way? And finally, is there a way to transparently price that in markets? So those are some tough questions, and I'm kind of glad I'm not there to have to figure it out. But if I were still there, I hate to do this backseat driving business, I think I would want to engage in some sort of a technical conference because, and I think you can already see a robust set of comments being filed. In fact, an entire group of former commissioners filed comments, and they were very strong. But I would love to hear from the experts and the technical experts on all sides about, should we go down this road? And if so, how do we go about it? So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for the question, Caitlin. Okay, you choose. I'm not going to choose.
The question I would ask is, as an engineer, what I've seen in looking at some of these things is the long length of time it takes to permit anything.
Yes.
Do you see any ways in which the time scale that we can do it? Yes, people need to have a right to say things, and you have to have some time. But I've seen things drying on for 10 years
Yes.
to permit a transmission line, and
That's
that seems like an enormously long time to do it.
It's an unacceptable amount of time, and thank you for asking the question. So we're challenged with that with regard to lots of types of infrastructure. One is because it's a public body. There is a legislative mandate from Congress to carry out some of that work in different ways. I'm speaking right now on the pipeline side. A lot of work takes place even before a proposed project is filed with FERC. That process can take 2 years. Then there's a scoping process and then public meetings. And honestly, I got letters from the Hill, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, complaining that we didn't give enough time. So FERC is still being squeezed between this rock and a hard place, and I don't say that for you to be sympathetic for them. It's just that it's the challenge of the job. So that's this I call special project side, pipelines, hydropower facilities. We were working on hydropower reforms when I was there, and I think just today at the FERC open meeting, they had a presentation on a hydropower reform matter and LNG terminal matters. Everyone says either that it takes too long or it doesn't take long enough. And
that's certainly the case we have today. It takes a long, long time. I'm wondering, is there a way where one can fairly short? Do you see any changes in policy or changes in operation that say force 3 or 4 commissions to deal with things, sometimes with 3 or 4 jurisdictions to deal with things at the same time?
Well, on the transmission side, so on the pipeline side and the side that is more prescriptively mandated by Congress, it's going to take some legislative changes. Good luck with that. Well, we can't get a darn thing passed right now. On the transmission side, I totally agree. Even in my tenure, there were dockets that I had to review, and I thought, why in the heck am I approving a docket that started 5 years ago, or a transmission line that started 10 years ago? Now, FERC has a lot of opportunity there, and FERC has been working, and I'm really proud of the work that we carried out during my tenure, focused on interconnection queue reform. What is in that queue? Why is it taking so darn long in the queue? And basically, how can we improve technical processes and administrative processes to expedite that? Why are these studies taking so long? Why do you have to start back over in the queue if you get a new technological update for a piece of the project that you are going to implement? So FERC is very well aware of that, working on that right now. Also working on removing barriers to innovation. So creating a climate where energy storage can participate. That will be helpful too, as there are more and more renewables being integrated on the grid. And so I agree with you, it's taking far too long, but the glimmer of hope is that we are seeing progress. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thank you, guys.
Well, you anticipated me. I was going to ask you to join me in thanking Colette Honorable, and also to invite you to join us in the reception next door where we can continue some of these conversations. So thank you so much, Commissioner Honorable, for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I need to give you mine.